Evening, Jim.
Hello, Peter.
Crikey. I know it's been only a few months, but I haven't actually seen it yet.
Yup, nasty explosion. Killed 5 people plus the engine.
Well, no duh. An engine surviving its own spoiler explosion. How could it? The two men stood on the edge of what used to be the Elsbridge Viaduct. It was late at night. A few months ago, one of the old Timothy Nefford and Elsbridge light railway coffee pots had suffered from a boiler explosion on the same bridge. Ever since then, the bridge had been annihilated. The engine, crew, and the trucks had been pulling at the time, which was more than usual, had all been killed nearly instantly. Pieces of rubble had struck the road bridge not so far away, bending itself out of place. One stone had struck a car, taking the life of the family inside. The Els Bridge was no more. For the time being. Such a historic landmark had to be rebuilt, especially since it supplied the railway with its connection to the ports. Meanwhile, lorries had taken their job. The following weeks, which turned to months, showed a quick surge of progression towards the return of the bridge to its former glory, as well as connecting the rail lines back up from Mayfleet to Elsbridge. Men often had to work late into the night for the following months to try to complete it. It was a cold October night Jim and Peter were working. Cold air swept around them, making them bundle up. Peter came from Vickerstown. He lived there with his wife Anne. He knew all about the news of the landmark turning into rubble. All of the island did. He had volunteered to come help. Jim, Anne's brother, and Peter's brother-in-law, worked for the Timothy Nefford and Elsbridge Light Railway. He was its lead engineer. He lived in northern Elsbridge. He heard the explosion when it happened, and was quickly on the scene for the wreckage. He had been helping out ever since to rebuild the connection. For now, it was simply a gap between the railway. Jim, Peter, and the rest of the crew were there to fill the empty gap. The Els Bridge didn't lay too high above the water. It was way above, so where if you jumped off, you would survive, albeit with a few broken bones for the shallow water. But now, there was a large pit in the water below. In the night, there seemed to be nothing in between the gap. Only the occasional sound of the stream below signified that a body of water was there. The men worked all night. Jim and Peter stood on the bridge on the end of it. The abyss below was cold. The murky water churned in unnatural ways. Peter stared at it coldly, and it seemed like it was calling out to him to jump in, join it. So, he's down there? Or his remains are? Peter asked, cutting through the silence. He smacked his lips so they wouldn't freeze together. He cracked his head upwards and stared into the sky to try to distract the thought.
Yup, fell right in. They saw some parts flying in a bunch of directions, but most of them is down there.
Peter didn't dare look down. It felt too unnatural. To think, somewhere in the water, under all the rubble, was an engine laying there, dead. And you're sure he's dead, right?
Sure hope so. It'd be torture, stuck for what must feel like an eternity under all that mud and rubble. It'd be too dangerous to send a diving team down there as well. They'd be joining him down there if one of them stones fell on them.
Peter sighed and brought his hand to his face, which held a cup. He sipped it. Good cocoa, he croaked, and he peered back down. Shame they can't even get the crew's bodies.
If they're even in contact,
scoffed Jim again. Peter squirmed.
Oh, come on. You seriously think a person could survive a sudden surge of heat like that? Nevertheless, hot metal exploding right in their faces would have exploded like a balloon.
He made a popping sound with his lips and nudged Peter. Peter gulped. You think it hurts?
Maybe. It would have been quick, though. Now that's how I want to go out.
Yeah.
Els. His name was Els. Ironic, isn't it? Named after the same thing he died on.
Oh. Yeah. How's the railway dealing from, this, anyways? Jim laughed shamefully.
Terrible, he scoffed. They're trying their best, but I know it won't make it. The lorries took the connection jobs to Elves, Corham, and Napridge. Once the employers realize they're quicker, well, most of our businesses will be ditching us. And don't even get me started on the engines. Tid and Nap were left on the lower part, which left Farr and Glenson alone up here. Nothing wrong with Glenson, but a crane engine isn't the best for running services with. We actually had to loan one of the A.W. Dry & Co. engines out to help with the services up here.
A.W. Dry & Co.?
Yeah, they're an engineering company. They built the coffee pots for the line. They're up at Maithwaite. They got a little workshop and everything. Very smart fellows. Even got some of their crew on the bridge, and even supplying us. They redesigned the whole thing. They even loaned one of their engines. Remarkable design, and powerful. It's just, they're quiet, is all. Honestly, reminds me a lot of you.
The two became silent again.
How's Anne?
She's doing all right.
That's good.
How about you and Luke?
We're doing all right. He's too afraid to tell his family still.
I understand.
And told me you two were trying for a kid?
Oh, yeah. Jim glanced at Peter. He seemed pale.
Listen, you'll do great. Trust me, she's my sister, and I know who the best person for her is. And that's you.
He jabbed his finger into Peter's stomach. Peter laughed, then brushed it off. It's just being a dad. Are we even ready for that? We only just graduated from Maronside College a few years ago, and we just got married last year. Like,
hey.
Jim put his hand on Peter's shoulder. He was breathing heavily. He could feel it.
You're going to do great. I know you will.
And with a pat, he put his hand down. The silence of the night and the occasional hammering boomed once more. It was overcoming this time. The moon was bright and full. The stars shimmered, and the rails underneath them rumbled.
You feel that?
Jim questioned, turning sharply. Yeah?
Who's out this late?
Jim looked back quickly. Nothing. The line cut through the town. The few lights from the houses around the line that were still awake shimmered on the rails below. Suddenly, a shape broke out from behind one. It was an engine, but not one of the coffee pots. Is that one of the A.W. Dry engines?
Yeah, it looks like her. But what's she doing out here now? The last train was a half hour ago, and that was at Maithwaite. No engine should be coming down here. Oi! What you doing?
The engine didn't respond. It drew quickly forward. The men around working the night shift turned their attention onto the sight behind them. The engine was a scruffy little engine, with 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome. It drew closer and closer. No lamps were on the engine's running board, showing no sign of what the train was pulling. However, a guard's whistle cut through the air, telling them it was a passenger train.
The hell is she doing?
Cried Jim, who began to run up the line. He bent down and grabbed an oil lamp off the ground and began to swing it above him.
Stop! Stop!
He cried to the engine, but the only response now was harsh puffing, the crew jumping around in the cab, the yelling of passengers, and the harsh scream from the coach's brake blocks. Jim paused his run to look at the engine. It wore a solemn face, and it showed no expression. It puffed past, ignoring him. The driver had jumped out of the cab while the firemen stood between the engine and coaches. He hastily uncoupled them from the engine as they became separate. The continuous screeching of brakes finally stopped as the coaches slowed to a halt, but the engine went on.
Clear the bridge!
Men emerged into the light as they scrambled out of the way of the approaching engine. There was a splat, crack, and a splash. Silence followed. The men stared in surprise. They walked less than an inch forward before a massive explosion of water erupted from the river. Jim ran forward as the water fell down, splashing the men. He and the men looked down. No sign of the engine was there. Nothing was there. Only the murky, dark abyss lay below. He turned back and looked at the men. Do we have everyone? He looked at the men who were all looking at each other. Everyone, right? No, there was a face missing. But who? Jim analyzed them all until a sudden shiver crept up his spine as he looked.
Where's Peter?
But that was a stupid question, right? He already knew exactly where he was. He turned around and looked back at the abyss. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he clutched his mouth in disbelief and fell to the wet grass below him. Tears had already begun to stream down his face. He didn't want to, but he couldn't help it. They kept falling and falling, just like Peter and the engine had.